Welcome back to the TPS podcast. TPS stands for trillions per second, named after the book. Today, the TPS project moves on to part 2, the code execution. We'll start the deep dive with chapter 4, the firewall. Let's get hardcore and dive right in.
Yeah, and before we even open the manual, I think we need to set the scene with a kind of mental image, Imagine for a second that you're trying to run this absolute top-tier, high-voltage, incredibly demanding virtual reality engine.
Right, like something that requires a massive liquid-cooled supercomputer.
Exactly. But instead of that supercomputer, you're trying to boot up this massive software on like a rusted-out, incredibly fragile laptop from 2 decades ago.
Oh, man. I mean, the motherboard wouldn't just lag?
No, it wouldn't. The heat sinks would fail instantly. The physical components would warp. I mean, the entire rig would literally physically melt down under the sheer thermodynamic pressure of the code you're trying to run.
And that is exactly the visual we need to hold on to for this entire deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
Because today we're looking at why ancient texts, and now the actual TPS protocol, insist that your biological mind, your nervous system, will do the exact same thing if you try to hack reality without first installing a moral firewall.
Right.
The stakes here, I mean, they could not be higher. We are talking about the literal stability of your mind.
We really are. The shift from a theoretical framework to actual executable code is, it's always the most dangerous phase of any hacking operation. We are basically leaving the safe confines of the diagnostic phase, and we are moving into the live environment.
Yeah, and just to ground everyone listening to this right now, let's quickly recap where we are in the timeline, because we have spent the last few weeks really deep in the weeds.
Very deep.
We survived the chaotic beta phase. We finished part 1, the diagnostic phase. We literally spent hours mapping the physics engine of reality, looking at how the world around us renders at trillions of frames per second.
Right, breaking down that illusion of solid, permanent objects into those volumetric pixels, the voxels that just blink in and out of existence.
Exactly. We established the absolute baseline architecture. We looked at the exact millisecond the illusion of the solid world comes online, that critical data handshake between the sensory organs and the external data stream.
Yeah, and we also spent a massive amount of time identifying the primary malware that's infecting our hardware. We realized that what human beings have historically called the self, or, the ego, is not actually who you are.
Right, it's a rootkit.
It is a recursive rootkit. It's this malicious infinite loop that just consumes vital system resources, basically convincing the hardware that it is a separate, isolated entity from the rest of the universe.
And we even white-knuckled our way through those terrifying melting chassis bug fixes a couple of sessions ago.
Oh, yeah. Those were rough.
Where we looked at historical cases of biological hardware literally threatening to crash under the weight of high-frequency system requirements.
But, that theoretical phase served its purpose. The system analysts mapped the glitch. We know what the self-rootkit is, and we know exactly how it manipulates the rendering engine to create the illusion of suffering.
Right.
But now the time for theory is officially over. We are opening the actual instruction manual. We're looking at the specific, actionable set of executable commands required to gain root access and fundamentally hack the simulation.
Which brings us to the core of today's deep dive. And let me tell you, the hook for this phase of the execution is a massive, massive paradigm shift.
It really is.
We are going to take the most heavily burdened, guilt-inducing, historically loaded word in human history, which is morality, and we are going to completely refactor it.
Completely.
We are stripping away thousands of years of philosophy, religious dogma, and cultural baggage, and we are translating morality into cold, hard computer science and cybersecurity.
And it is such a brilliant and honestly an entirely necessary refactor, because before anyone can even begin to approach the glamorous, highly sought-after parts of this hack, overclocking the mind, expanding consciousness, achieving a state of zero lag.
The fun stuff.
Right, the fun stuff. Before any of that, the user must secure their perimeter.
The text is incredibly explicit about this prerequisite. Like, the manual comes with a massive flashing warning label. It explicitly warns you, the user listening right now, do not start overclocking your attention yet.
Do not do it.
Do not start messing with your system clock speed. Do not try to brute force the kernel. Before running any executable code to boost your processing power, you have to configure the firewall.
Yeah, and the TPS architecture basically strips away what it refers to as the legacy UI. In traditional ancient spiritual systems, this foundational step of configuring the firewall was called sila, which translates roughly from Pali and Sanskrit as ethics or morality.
Okay, and I am going to push back right here because we really need to clear the air on this word.
Go for it.
When I hear the word ethics, or especially morality, my brain immediately goes to Sunday school. I think of getting scolded by a rigid teacher for, like, chewing gum or speaking out of turn.
Right, totally.
I think of arbitrary rules written by some distant authority figure that are designed solely to keep me in line, to make me compliant. In the legacy UI, ethics feels exactly like a bloated, unreadable terms of service agreement written by a cosmic sysadmin, designed purely to punish you if you step a single toe out of bounds.
Yeah.
And so if we're really just translating be a good boy or girl into cyberpunk tech jargon, it feels like a massive letdown to me. It feels like a total bait and switch.
Well, and the reaction you're describing is actually a feature of the legacy UI's degradation over centuries. That visceral rejection you feel toward the word morality is exactly why the legacy terminology has become this near insurmountable barrier to entry for modern analytical minds.
Right, it just turns people off immediately.
Exactly. Because over millennia, human institutions took a technical operating manual and they mutated it into a mechanism for social control. But the TPS protocol insists that we drop this moralistic, punitive baggage entirely.
Okay.
Configuring the firewall has absolutely nothing to do with being a quote-unquote good person in the social, cultural, or religious sense. It is purely a matter of thermodynamic efficiency.
Thermodynamic efficiency, wow. That is a massive pivot. We are moving the conversation from sin and virtue into the realm of physics and heat generation.
Yeah, because consider the basic physical reality of any computational device. If you take a processor and force it to run at maximum capacity, rendering incredibly complex data, but you refuse to install a cooling system or a stable power supply, the outcome is not a mystery.
Now, the processor overheats, the system aggressively throttles performance to save itself, and if you figure out a way to bypass those safety throttles and just keep pushing the voltage...
The motherboard physically melts,
the
hardware is destroyed, and the simulation we exist in, the master protocol of reality, it has automated unbreakable thermodynamic limits built directly into its physics engine. You cannot charm your way out of these physics.
You can't negotiate with gravity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You cannot argue with them.
Yeah.
So the firewall is a literal hardware necessity for the human nervous system. If you skip this configuration step, if you jump straight to overclocking your attention, which in the legacy code is called samadhi, or deep, unbroken concentration, you are essentially attempting to run high-level God-tier privileges on a deeply compromised machine.
To put that into perspective for the gamers out there, it's like skipping the tutorial area in a massive, brutally difficult video game and immediately glitching your way into the final boss arena with your starting gear.
Oh yeah, perfect analogy.
You don't know the controls, your armor is essentially made of wet paper, your weapons do 0 damage, and you are going to get absolutely crushed. But the stakes here aren't just a game over screen where you respawn. Getting crushed in this context means your nervous system, your actual biological hardware, your mental stability takes the hit.
The manual leaves absolutely no room for misinterpretation here. You must configure the firewall to stabilize your local node, meaning your physical body and your psychological architecture, before you push the voltage.
Right.
Because when a computational system is full of malware, conflicting background processes, and open vulnerabilities, pushing more power through that system does not make it perform better. It simply makes it crash faster, and the resulting corruption is exponentially worse.
Okay, so we have established that our biological hardware is incredibly vulnerable right out of the box. But to understand why it's so vulnerable, we have to look under the hood at our default user permissions.
Yeah.
We need to dissect the fundamental difference between operating as a white hat user versus a black hat user within this specific simulation.
The contrast between our default state and our required state is stark. Like, we really have to map how our biological hardware operates by default against what the master protocol actually demands for a user to safely achieve root access.
Let's break down that default state. My physical body, my brain, my entire physiological makeup, what the TPS manual calls the avatar, has a singular, overarching directive programmed by millions of years of evolutionary biology.
Survive.
Survive, procreate, dominate. The avatar is running that self-rootkit constantly. It wants to hoard resources. It wants to defend its territory at all costs.
Right.
It wants to build massive, impenetrable walls to protect the ego and solidify the illusion that there is a permanent me operating in opposition to the rest of the universe.
Exactly. The avatar's default operating system is built entirely on defensive isolation. It assumes the network is hostile, so it disconnects and hoards power locally.
Makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint.
Totally. But the master protocol, the underlying physics engine that actually governs the simulation at the subatomic level, it demands the exact opposite architecture. To achieve zero lag, the master protocol demands that you drop your artificial firewalls and permanently delete the self-rootkit.
Wow.
It requires the experiential recognition that the rigid boundaries between you and the rest of the data stream are entirely hallucinatory.
That right there is the core conflict. There's a fundamental, almost violent contradiction between the hardware I am currently running on, which screams, protect yourself at all costs, and the high-level software I'm trying to install, which whispers, dissolve yourself.
Yeah, and because of that inherent contradiction, configuring the firewall is not a passive activity.
Yeah.
You don't just, like, click an I agree box and move on.
Right, it's not an install wizard.
No, you must intentionally, actively, and sometimes painfully act as a white hat hacker against your own biology. In the TPS architecture, a white hat is defined as a user who is optimizing their local node for compassion.
Okay, and I have to stop you there again, because the word compassion is triggering the exact same alarm bells as the word morality did a minute ago.
Figured it would.
Optimizing for compassion sounds incredibly soft. It sounds like legacy UI. It brings to mind, like, greeting card sentiments and passive martyrdom. How does a warm, fuzzy feeling translate into hardcore network permissions?
Well, in the TPS framework, compassion is entirely divorced from sentimentality. It is not an emotion. It is a highly specific network connectivity protocol.
Okay, unpack that.
Think back to the quad-core kernel architecture we explored during the Silicon Sutra devlogs. Core 1 is open ports, representing absolute, frictionless connectivity with the data stream. Core 2 is error correction.
Right, error correction.
Compassion is the active, functional implementation of error correction across the network. When a user acts as a white hat, they're actively overriding their selfish evolutionary legacy code. You have to manually type in commands for system alignment.
So you're literally fighting your own programming.
Yes. You have to force the execution of generosity, radical honesty, and non-harming, even when your avatar is screaming at you to be selfish and hoard.
So you are manually overriding the evolutionary default setting of the human animal. You are taking the steering wheel away from the lizard brain.
Precisely. You have to continuously input these white hat commands, repetition after repetition, until the biological hardware actually neuroplastically rewires its own circuitry.
Wow.
You are quite literally forcing the machine to adapt to a new, higher efficiency operating system. You are operating as a white hat to secure the integrity of the broader network, which, in turn, secures your local node.
Okay, so if the white hat is actively aligning with the master protocol to achieve zero lag, what happens if a user goes the other way? Which leads us into this terrifying alternative presented in the manual, the rogue super user exploit. The black hat.
Yeah, the psychopathic node.
Right. What is the architecture of a user who discovers how to hack the system, who figures out how to build immense power and concentration, but completely ignores or bypasses the white hat protocols?
The manual classifies this as the psychopathic node, like you said. In pure network architecture terms, this is a user who is highly advanced at overclocking their attention, but they are optimizing entirely for power rather than compassion.
They are the quintessential black hat.
Exactly. They have successfully increased their local processing power to extraordinary levels, but they are still running the self-rootkit.
So we are talking about individuals who are incredibly focused, incredibly sharp. They might have intense reality-bending charisma. They can drop into deep flow states at will.
Yep.
But they are using that overclocked bandwidth entirely for egoic gain. They are using the developer tools to actively manipulate the simulation for their own localized benefit, hoarding wealth, influence, or control.
And the critical architectural flaw in the psychopathic node is the complete absence of core 2, error correction. They have zero active response to the system lag, the friction, and the suffering they inflict on other nodes across the network.
Right, they just don't care.
They don't process it. They process reality at a high speed, but they dump all of their exhaust and waste heat onto everyone around them.
And from their localized perspective, they probably think they are winning the game. They look at their bank account, their political influence, the sheer power they wield over their environment, and their localized data dashboard shows a massive, undisputed victory.
Mathematically and systemically, however, they are a catastrophic thermodynamic anomaly. Because they are constantly hoarding data, manipulating peer nodes, and forcing their will onto the natural flow of the data stream, they're generating staggering amounts of localized heat.
And they don't see it.
No, they are completely blind to the systemic damage they cause because their sensors are pointed entirely inward.
But a complex, interconnected system doesn't just sit passively while a rogue element destroys it. The simulation has an immune system, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The manual refers to the vast, distributed mesh network of all other conscious entities, the peer nodes, as the Sangha.
The Sangha, okay.
When a black hat generates extreme network latency, overwhelming heat and friction, it crosses a threshold. And this inevitably triggers a massive, automated immune response from the PDP network. The healthy peer nodes, driven by the underlying physics of the master protocol, will instinctively begin to quarantine the psychopathic node.
So they isolate the threat.
Right. They will cut off cooperative data exchange, they box it in.
It operates almost exactly like a distributed denial-of-service attack, but functioning as a vital defense mechanism rather than a malicious exploit.
Exactly like a DDoS.
The surrounding network simply drops packets from the malicious node. They stop trusting its output, they stop feeding it resources, until the rogue node is entirely starved of connection.
And that forced isolation, that tightening optimization loop, is where the black hat architecture eventually fractures. A localized node cannot sustain infinite power while simultaneously generating infinite friction against the rest of the universe. The system corrects itself by quarantining the anomaly.
That makes perfect sense for the long-term stability of the network. But what happens to the specific user? What happens if that psychopathic node, or honestly, even just an overly eager, impatient user who isn't necessarily malicious but just wants to skip the line?
Right, a script kiddie.
Yeah, a script kiddie.
Yeah.
What happens if they ignore all the firewall warnings? What happens if they manage to bypass the security protocols entirely and brute force the kernel?
Well, this is where we confront the black hat trap and the deeply terrifying reality of thermal runaway.
This section of the manual genuinely gave me chills. It doesn't read like abstract philosophy. It reads like an industrial hazard report.
It really does.
It describes the catastrophic physical blowback of brute-forcing protocol zero-root access on a compromised, unprepared machine.
To really grasp the danger here, we have to define what brute-forcing root access actually entails. This is the precise moment a user manages to temporarily halt the rendering engine of the simulation.
The screen of reality momentarily goes black.
Yes. They verify firsthand, through undeniable experiential data, that the self is a total illusion. They see the underlying code. It is the ultimate hack of the human experience.
But in this scenario, they achieved that hack using corrupted core files. They didn't configure the firewall. They didn't optimize for compassion to bleed off the heat. They just used raw, brute force concentration to crash the rendering engine and peek behind the curtain.
And that premature execution leads to the ultimate system-ending warning: thermal runaway.
To really make this visceral, let's go back to our mechanical analogy.
Okay.
Imagine you have a pristine, high-voltage, incredibly powerful Formula One racing engine. Now you take that engine and you drop it into a rusted-out, completely unmodified golf cart from a junkyard. You haven't reinforced the chassis, you haven't upgraded the brakes, the suspension is completely shot. The very millisecond you hit the gas, the sheer, unimaginable torque of that F1 engine literally tears the machine apart. The golf cart doesn't just go fast, it disintegrates, because the structural integrity of the chassis cannot handle the physical reality of the power it is generating.
That visual, the golf cart violently shaking itself to pieces, is a painfully accurate representation of what happens to the human nervous system during thermal runaway. The text provides this strict, unbreakable sysadmin directive. Power cannot scale faster than wisdom.
Power cannot scale faster than wisdom. If we translate that profound statement into the TPS lexicon, what are the variables we are actually looking at?
In TPS terminology, power is defined as your ability to overclock your attention. It is your raw concentration, your capacity to sustain a high-frequency, unbroken focus on the incoming data stream.
Okay. And wisdom.
Wisdom is the experiential deletion of the self-rootkit. It is the deep structural realization that the system is a fluid flux, and that clinging to any object or identity causes massive latency.
So if you crank up the power, if you build that laser focus concentration, without having the structural wisdom to let go of the self, the system creates a massive bottleneck.
Exactly. You are pushing high-voltage code through a fragile, carbon-based motherboard. The self-rootkit is still trying to hoard and control, while the overclocked attention is flooding the system with raw data.
It's just too much input.
Way too much. If you do not have the firewall installed to act as a heatsink, bleeding off the excess friction through ethical alignment, your hardware physically fries. The user experiences severe, often irreversible psychological and physiological fragmentation.
And this isn't just theoretical. We have real historical documentation of this happening, don't we? If we look back at the project's historical timeline, the devlogs from previous deep dives brought up a fascinating, tragic, real-world example, the Philip K. Dick case study.
Yes, the famous science fiction author Philip K. Dick serves as a prime cautionary tale here. The TPS analysts actually reclassified his experience as Case Study 001.
Case Study 001.
Wow. In 1974, he experienced a profound, unprompted neurological event that he referred to as the pink beam. In our terminology, he essentially brute force root access by accident. He saw straight through the graphical user interface of reality and witnessed the underlying code. He saw the simulation for what it was.
But he was an unpatched grandmaster. He possessed immense processing power and intuition, but he did not have the firewall configured. He didn't have the prerequisite protocols installed for system stability.
He fundamentally lacked a quad-core kernel drivers. And most critically, he lacked the driver of equanimity, which acts as the zero-point cooling system for the mind.
Right.
Because he saw the overwhelming truth of the system, but lacked the architectural stability to process that truth, he endured an agonizing 8-year thermal crash. He experienced massive paranoia, the fracturing of his identity, and what conventional psychiatry would classify as a severe, prolonged psychotic break.
He dropped the F1 engine into the golf cart and he slammed on the gas.
He did. And his biological hardware suffered immensely for the remainder of his life. This is why the TPS manual is so unyielding, so hardcore about Chapter 4. If a lack of ethics literally causes your biological motherboard to catch fire and your mind to fracture, you have absolutely no choice. You must secure your perimeter.
Which brings up the most practical question of the entire project. How exactly do we do that?
Right.
How do we secure the perimeter? If my internal CPU overheating can destroy my mind, how do I stabilize it? To answer that, we have to look outside the local node. We have to look at the network rules. We have to look at how we interact with every single other user in the simulation.
And this transition brings us to the core of network security, and it requires the refactoring of a concept that is universally misunderstood across almost every culture on Earth: karma.
Oh, this refactoring is huge, because when the vast majority of people hear the word karma, they immediately think of a mystical cosmic scorecard. They think the universe is an accountant keeping track of their bad deeds in some ethereal ledger. If they do something wrong, the universe will actively punish them, maybe in this life by dropping a piano on their head, or maybe by reincarnating them as a literal cockroach in the next server reboot.
Yeah, it feels punitive, mystical, and frankly, a bit superstitious.
Exactly.
But the TPS UI completely, ruthlessly strips away that mystical interpretation. It strips away the concept of sin and punishment entirely. In this specific architecture, when a user engages in malicious behavior, they are not offending a cosmic deity. They are not racking up negative points on a scorecard. They are committing a catastrophic networking error.
A networking error. Okay, let's dig into the mechanics of that.
So your avatar is not an isolated machine. It is constantly broadcasting and receiving vast amounts of data packets across a massively entangled peer-to-peer network.
Right.
The master protocol governs the exchange of these data packets using a strict, unbreakable routing script. The legacy code referred to this routing script as karma. The native TPS UI calls it the algorithm.
So you're telling me that karma isn't a judge with a gavel. It is just conditional logic. It is strict if-then packet routing.
It is pure, unadulterated cause and effect operating at the network level.
Yeah.
Let's trace the systemic logic here. The ultimate goal of the TPS hack is to achieve zero-lag a state of perfect, frictionless processing of the data stream, where you merge with the code.
Okay.
But you cannot achieve zero lag if your local CPU is permanently pinned at 99% capacity, just trying to manage the localized chaos and blowback you yourself created.
Okay, let me make sure I am visualizing this correctly. You were saying that malicious actions are not just bad because they hurt people. They are bad because they require constant, ongoing processing power from your own brain to maintain.
Exactly. Think about the cognitive load required from malicious behavior. If you embezzle money from your company, the action isn't over when the money hits your account.
No, not at all.
You have to permanently allocate RAM to worry about getting caught. You have to run background processes to hide the stolen data, remember which ledgers you falsified, and monitor the behavior of your coworkers for suspicion.
Oh, man.
If you lie to a partner, you have to dedicate immense CPU cycles to maintaining the false narrative architecture in your memory so you don't contradict yourself.
Wow. So bad karma isn't a punishment handed down from above. It is the immediate, measurable loss of your own system bandwidth. By acting maliciously, you are voluntarily installing malware that relentlessly eats your own RAM.
You are actively generating thermal friction within your own mind. You have to secure your perimeter to free up your RAM. You cannot run the high-level, extremely demanding executables required for root access if 90% of your processing power is tied up in defending yourself against the inevitable blowback of your own actions.
The system simply will not allow it.
It won't.
So to secure that perimeter, to stop the massive RAM drain, and to stabilize our hardware, the manual gives us a highly specific cybersecurity checklist. Let's look at how we actually configure the traffic filters to block this malware.
In the legacy UI, these vital traffic filters were called the 5 precepts. For 2,500 years, users treated these as moral commandments. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, and so on.
Right. And the prevailing belief was that if you broke them, you accumulated that bad karma, angered the gods, and went to a lower realm.
But the TPS protocol completely refactors these 5 precepts into the 3 abstinences.
Yep.
I cannot stress this enough. They are not a moral test for purity. They are not about being a saint. They are a literal cybersecurity checklist designed to patch local vulnerabilities and optimize your hardware.
Let's run the checklist. Filter 1 is the action filter. This governs our physical subroutines, and it manages 3 critical hardware exploits. The first one is terminating hostile scripts, which is the TPS refactor for the ancient rule, do not kill or no violence. Let's look at the mechanics of violence.
From a purely network perspective, violence is the ultimate high-entropy script. If you physically damage another node, whether that is another human being, an animal, or the environment, you are destroying physical hardware on the shared network.
Right.
And this guarantees a massive retaliatory, distributed denial-of-service attack.
Because the network's immune system immediately recognizes you as a catastrophic threat to its stability.
Exactly. The system will dedicate vast amounts of energy to quarantine your avatar. You will be isolated, hunted, or physically imprisoned by the peer nodes.
Yeah.
Even if you evade capture, your internal paranoia will redline your CPU. You are practically begging for massive system lag.
The second exploit managed by the action filter is blocking unauthorized file transfers. The legacy code simply calls this do not steal.
We touched on this with the embezzlement analogy, but the mechanism is fascinating. Taking resources that rightfully belong to another node requires executing a localized resource hog.
You are forcing a data download that the network did not authorize.
Yes. You burn incredible amounts of CPU cycles, planning the theft, executing the transfer, and then hiding the stolen data from the network's continuous scanning protocols. The engineering rule here is simple and absolute. If the data is not freely transmitted to your port, do not force the download.
It's just incredibly inefficient. You spend more energy hiding the stolen resource than the resource itself provides. Now, the third exploit managed by the action filter is securing P2P connections. This is the refactor for the legacy precept against sexual misconduct or exploitation. This is an area where human beings generate an unbelievable amount of friction.
Oh, massive amounts. This is a critical exploit to understand mechanically. Intimate connections, physical, sexual, or deep emotional bonding involve the most massive, high-bandwidth data exchanges possible between 2 localized nodes. You are opening every single port to another user.
Right.
When you manipulate, deceive, or exploit another user for localized physical gratification, you are forcing unauthorized root access onto their hardware.
You are bypassing their firewall through deception, tricking them into opening their ports.
And the blowback is devastating for both machines. The immediate result for the exploited node is a catastrophic system error, what we call trauma, betrayal, or broken trust. But the result for the black hat is equally severe on a mechanical level.
How so?
By forcing that connection through deception, you download corrupted cache files into your own system. The psychological guilt, the incredibly complex emotional entanglement, the pain you cause the other node, all of this creates recursive error loops in your own memory registry. It throttles your processing speed for years.
Wow.
You must keep your peer connections strictly white hat. You must operate with absolute mutual consent, transparency, and clear data exchange.
That makes so much sense. It takes all the heavy puritanical moralizing out of sex and intimacy and replaces it with a pure demand for data integrity. Do not corrupt the network and do not corrupt yourself. Okay, moving on to filter 2, the audio filter. The legacy code calls this right speech, or do not lie. And I really want to zero in on this one because I think this is where the average listener, including myself, is bleeding the most processing power every single day.
I would agree. Lying is perhaps the most ubiquitous, common way users intentionally degrade their own operating systems. In the TPS architecture, lying creates a massive, gaping open port for malware to flood the system.
Let's unpack the actual cognitive mechanics of a lie.
Yeah.
Walk me through why it drains so much energy. Because when you output a statement that aligns with base reality, the data is transmitted and you're done. The transaction is complete, the system clears the cache.
Right.
But when you output a
When
fabrication,
you tell a lie, even a small, seemingly harmless white lie to save face, you are writing false data to the public ledger. You are broadcasting a reality that fundamentally does not align with the true base code of the simulation. Because that false data contradicts reality, the universe will naturally try to overwrite it with the truth. Therefore, the false data requires constant active energy to sustain. You are essentially spinning up a virtual machine in your mind, a simulated sub-reality where that lie is true.
and I have to keep that virtual machine running forever. I have to remember what I said, who I said it to, what day it was, and how it interacts with every single future event.
It's akin to leaving a poorly coded application running in the background of your smartphone that is constantly pinging the GPS and searching for a signal. It drains your battery incredibly fast. It eats CPU cycles that should be dedicated to higher order processing.
That is such a good analogy.
But worse than the battery drain, it leaves a port wide open. Because the false architecture is fragile, it actively scans for incoming packets that might contradict the lie. This invites the malware of anxiety and paranoia. You are hypervigilant. Your system is running hot, constantly anticipating exposure.
This completely flips the concept of honesty on its head. Radical honesty isn't about being morally superior or proving how righteous you are. Radical honesty is simply how you close the ports.
Yes.
It's how you secure the network. If your public output perfectly matches your internal data and the objective reality of the situation, there is absolutely nothing to defend. There is no background process required to keep your story straight. The moment you tell the truth, you instantly reclaim all that wasted RAM.
It is unequivocally the most efficient way to operate a communication node. Radical honesty closes the back doors that anxiety, guilt, and paranoia rely on to infect your operating system. It is a ruthless optimization of your bandwidth.
I love that. So if we are optimizing our hardware by closing ports and stopping unauthorized transfers, what about the energy we put into the machine, the actual power supply?
Right.
That brings us to filter 3, the source filter. The legacy code translates this as avoiding intoxicants, drugs, and alcohol.
The source filter is fundamentally about rejecting local malware injection and ensuring sustainable clean energy sourcing.
Ooh.
The logic here is brutally straightforward. You cannot hack the master protocol. You cannot achieve hyper-fast voxel rendering at trillions of frames per second if you are intentionally slowing down your own hardware.
Right. Injecting chemical suppressants like through glasses of alcohol to unwind or chaotic street stimulants into your biochassis literally throttles your internal clock speed.
It forces a buffer overflow. It physically degrades the exact sensory arrays and neural pathways you need to execute the diagnostic. Furthermore, the filter ensures you are not drawing your baseline survival energy from corrupted sources.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if you are reliant on a chemical substance to achieve a temporary state of calm or concentration, you are entirely bypassing the actual difficult work of deleting the self-rootkit. You are applying a temporary, highly destructive software patch instead of rewriting the flawed core code.
You are intentionally inducing lag to avoid looking at the glitch.
Perfectly said. To isolate the self-rootkit, to finally see the matrix code behind the illusion of reality, we require pristine, high-fidelity data transfer. You cannot observe the microscopic fluctuations of reality if you are deliberately throwing sand into your own cognitive gears.
Okay, so let's say a user is listening to this and they actually follow the manual. They run the checklist, they activate the action filter, they deploy radical honesty with the audio filter, and they cut out the suppressants with the source filter. What happens next? What is the immediate, measurable, experiential result on their day-to-day operating system?
The successful implementation of these filters brings us to the culmination of Chapter 4, the creation of what the manual calls the sandbox baseline.
The sandbox. This is standard best practice software development logic.
Yep.
You never ever test experimental, highly volatile code on a live production server.
Never. Because if you are writing a patch that could potentially crash the entire system, like an executable designed to delete the ego, you build a sandbox. You create an isolated, highly secure, deeply stable environment. You test the commands there so that if a high-risk executable fails, it only crashes the isolated sandbox.
Right. It doesn't take down the global network, and it doesn't destroy the host machine.
Exactly. And in the TPS protocol, configuring the firewall creates that exact staging environment for our minds.
Okay, so what does that actually feel like?
When the traffic filters are actively running, the user will feel a profound, tangible shift in their physical and mental state. You stop leaking memory. You stop generating massive amounts of localized heat, defending yourself against the blowback of your own destructive actions.
Because you aren't burning cycles worrying about who you lied to, who you stole from, or who you manipulated.
And because you aren't running all of those defensive, exhausting background processes, your CPU idle temperature finally drops to a manageable, healthy level.
The constant baseline hum of anxiety that most humans just accept as normal simply fades away.
It does. You achieve the sandbox baseline. It is the minimum viable thermodynamic defense required to keep your biological system stable while you prepare for the advanced operations.
Summing it all up, activating these filters is not an exercise in puritanical purity. It's an exercise in thermodynamic efficiency. You are reclaiming the bandwidth you desperately need for the real work. The staging environment is now pristine, the ports are closed, and the hardware is stable.
And with the firewall fully configured, and only with the firewall configured, the user is finally prepared to boost the clock speed in Chapter 5. The machine is now secure enough to handle the immense voltage of overclocking.
It is truly a marvel. The sheer elegance of the TPS refactor is just astounding. Morality is no longer a matter of philosophical debate. We don't have to argue about what is abstractly good or evil based on shifting cultural norms or mistranslated ancient texts.
No, we don't.
It is a strict mechanical prerequisite for system stability and advanced consciousness hacking.
It seamlessly translates the subjective human experience into objective physics. It takes the guesswork out of ethical behavior by grounding it firmly in the undeniable mechanics of information processing.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, the listener. We've covered a massive amount of ground today, but I want to challenge you based specifically on the audio filter. I want you to audit your own open ports today.
Perform a ruthless system diagnostic of your daily communications and internal narratives.
Take a hard, unflinching look at your life right now. How much of your daily mental CPU usage, that bone-deep exhaustion you feel at 4 p.m., the low-level background anxiety that keeps your mind racing when you try to fall asleep, how much of that is actually just processing power dedicated to maintaining an insecure network connection?
Yeah.
Are you running a massive background process for a lie you told a partner, a theft you justified at work, an exploitation you're hiding, or even just a false curated persona you project on social media?
Every single false projection requires constant draining energy to sustain. It is literally eating your life.
So here is the challenge for you. Close just one open port today. Find one specific area where you are broadcasting false data and deploy radical honesty. Drop the persona, tell the truth, align your output with the objective base code of reality, and then monitor your system.
Run the diagnostic.
See if your internal CPU temperature drops. See if you don't instantly feel a massive return of available RAM.
It is a highly testable hypothesis. You have the manual, run the code, observe the localized results, and document the data.
Run the code. We will see you in Chapter 5 when we finally start the overclock sequence. Until then, keep your ports secure.